At a quiet bank branch in Connecticut, an elderly black man in a wheelchair rolled in, dressed simply, barely noticed by anyone. The front desk clerk was dismissive, openly disrespecting him, in front of other customers. But what she didn't know was, he was a senior shareholder of the entire banking system, and when the truth came out, she was going to regret everything. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you're watching from. We love to hear your thoughts. The automatic doors of Sunrise Credit Union, a squat red brick building off a sleepy main road in Millbridge, Connecticut, hissed open at exactly 9:03 a.m. The early morning sun caught the polished tile floor, still faintly damp from the janitor's mop, casting long reflections beneath the soft whir of fluorescent ceiling lights. A light citrus scent mixed with copier toner hung in the air behind the front desk. Staff were just settling in, adjusting name tags, chatting about weekend errands, half drinking lukewarm coffee from paper cups. A woman in scrubs held her to-go cup near the ATM kiosk. An elderly man in a veteran's cap sat quietly in the waiting area, reading yesterday's paper. A teenage boy leaned against the wall by the brochures, earbuds in, texting under his sleeve. Everyone noticed the sound of the door, but no one really looked up. Until he rolled in. Harold Jennings, 68, African-American, trim but weathered, moved through the doorway in a wheelchair that creaked faintly with age. He wore a slate-gray windbreaker zipped to the collar, charcoal slacks that were perfectly pressed, and a faded navy baseball cap tugged low over his brow. His beard was trimmed close to his jaw, grizzled white with patches of stubborn black near the chin. His eyes, dark and steady, scanned the room without urgency. His hands, large and calloused from years of labor, gripped the wheels with a control that said he didn't need help and wouldn't ask for it. He circled the lobby slowly, like he was getting a feel for the place. No one greeted him. A few eyes flicked up and down, then moved on. One woman clutched her purse a little closer to her lap. The teenager stopped texting, watching him like he wasn't sure whether to offer help or move aside. At the front counter, Tracy Miller, 35, white, hair bleached platinum and flat-ironed to a blade-sharp bob, didn't glance up from her computer. Harold approached the counter, quiet and steady. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth and low. "Could I speak with the branch manager, please?" Tracy sighed without looking. "Do you have an appointment?" Her tone wasn't rude, exactly. It was the kind that came wrapped in prejudgment, short, mechanical, preemptively annoyed. "No, ma'am, but I'd appreciate—" She cut him off with a single raised hand, palm out like a stop sign. Then she turned halfway in her chair and leaned toward her co-worker, lowering her voice just enough to feel private, but loud enough for Harold to hear. "Betty's here to cash someone else's check or make a scene about fees." Her words weren't spit out with anger. They were worse, casual, practiced, like it wasn't the first time. The man in the veteran's cap glanced up from his paper. The woman in scrubs furrowed her brow. The teenager took one earbud out. But no one said anything. Harold blinked slowly, not in surprise, just assessment. His fingers curled slightly around the armrest of his chair, but he didn't let his voice change. "I can wait," he said calmly. "But I'd still like to speak with the manager." Tracy finally looked up. "Sort of." Her eyes flicked across his hat, his jacket, his wheelchair, then quickly back to her screen. She exhaled audibly, a breath heavy with performance. "Sir, unless you're a client, the manager doesn't have time for walk-ins. If you're not here for a deposit or appointment, you can take a seat like everyone else." "I'm not here to withdraw money," Harold answered evenly. "Then what are you here for?" she snapped, voice rising a notch. "Because I'm really not in the mood to play guesswork this morning." That did it. The room shifted, not dramatically, just enough. The veteran set down his paper. The woman in scrubs straightened. The teenager's thumb hovered over his phone screen, not typing. Harold glanced at them once, briefly, then back at Tracy. He wasn't new to this. He'd been mistaken, dismissed, talked down to since his 20s. Once for walking into a hotel lobby, another time at a dealership he half owned. Today it was a bank again. He let his breath out slow, Not defeated, just measured. "Just the manager," he repeated. Tracy rolled her eyes hard, snatched a clipboard from the side counter, and slapped it onto the desk. "Fine, write your name down. Someone might see you in an hour." But Harold didn't reach for the clipboard. He opened the flap of a leather folder resting on his lap, methodical, like someone retrieving documents at a board meeting. Tracy pretended not to see. But the rustle of the folder caught the attention of Luis, a Latino man in his 40s seated at a side desk. He looked up, watched quietly. Harold unfolded a tri-folded document, stiff and white with a corporate header clearly visible. His hands didn't shake, he didn't fumble. He slid it across the desk with 2 fingers and tapped it once. "I'd appreciate it if you could hand this to your branch manager." Tracy didn't even read it. She pushed it aside with her pinky nail, looking almost offended. "We don't accept random paperwork. If you've got a complaint, there's a form online." "It's not a complaint," Harold said, still calm. "It's documentation." "Well, you're not on the appointment list, so unless you're a banker or a donor to this building, I suggest you sit down." She smiled that tight-lipped, performative smile, the kind that lets you know she's in control. And Harold, in that moment, knew what he had walked into. He'd seen enough, but he wasn't done yet. Harold sat still, his hands resting lightly on the rims of his wheelchair, his gaze steady, not confrontational, but resolute. He didn't shift, didn't raise his voice. Around him, the quiet murmur of the lobby had stilled, not completely, but noticeably. The woman in scrubs stopped sipping her coffee. The teenager lowered his phone slightly, watching now with both eyes. Even the man behind the teller window glanced over the top of his monitor. Luis Alvarez had been watching from the side hallway since Harold rolled in. Mid-40s, neatly dressed, name badge clipped just below his chest pocket, Luis had seen enough front desk incidents to know when one wasn't just about procedure. He stepped forward, not rushing, not interrupting, just present. "Is there a problem here?" His voice was soft but carried clearly across the lobby. His words didn't challenge, but they landed where they needed to. Tracy didn't turn her head. "No, I've got it, Luis," she said sharply, eyes still on her screen, fingers hovering like she was typing something of great importance. Just someone who forgot how appointments work. Luis stepped a little closer. "Miss Miller," he said, lowering his tone, "you might want to—" "I said I've got it," she snapped, her voice cracking just slightly at the end. Her neck stiffened, the tension visible even from across the room. Harold looked at Luis, gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. A thank you, restrained but meaningful. Luis held his position, arms crossed now, eyes never leaving Tracy. There was no threat in his posture, only a quiet insistence that someone had crossed a line and it was no longer going unnoticed. Tracy leaned her elbow on the counter, eyes narrowed at the document still sitting untouched next to the clipboard. "You people think demanding attention gets you service faster," she muttered, not even directing it at Harold anymore, just letting it hang there in the air like static. "It doesn't work like that here." There it was. Not yelled, not emphasized, but heard, felt, the weight of those 2 words, "you people," landed like a brick across the room. The man in the veteran's cap looked over. The teenage boy furrowed his brow. The woman in scrubs looked down into her coffee as if it might tell her what to do. Harold said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence following that comment said enough. It wasn't just that she'd said it. It was how easily it rolled off her tongue, like something she'd said before, like something she thought wouldn't be challenged. He exhaled quietly, measuring the breath so it wouldn't tremble. Then, slowly, he turned to Luis again. "Would you mind taking a look at this, please?" His voice remained calm, his eyes steady. Luis walked forward, reached for the folded paper, and read it, his expression changing almost immediately. His fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the page. He read the header once more, looked to the signature at the bottom, then turned toward Tracy with a quiet urgency in his tone. "This is from corporate," he said. Tracy's face twisted. "What?" Luis didn't answer immediately. He double-checked the document, his lips pressed into a line. "I think you should call Brian now." "For what?" Tracy's arms folded tightly across her chest, her voice defensive. "He's with a client, and I don't—" "Now," Louise repeated, firmer this time. Tracy hesitated, her jaw flexing. Her hand reached for the phone like it weighed more than usual. She turned her back to the lobby and dialed the internal line with 2 practiced presses. As she spoke in a muffled tone, Harold didn't watch her. He looked instead to the lobby, to the people watching this unfold, some pretending to scroll their phones, others just— The teenager whispered something to his mother, who didn't respond. She was too focused on Harold now. The man in the veteran's cap crossed one leg over the other and kept his eyes trained on Tracy. The room wasn't loud, but it wasn't neutral either. It held a new kind of silence. The kind that waits. Tracy hung up the phone with a click, turned around with a forced composure that didn't quite land. "He'll be out when he's free," she muttered, then stepped back from the desk as if to distance herself from everything she'd just said and done. Louise returned the paper to Harold with quiet hands. "Thank you for your patience, sir," he said. Harold gave him a slight nod. "We don't get many visits from corporate," Louise added, almost in a whisper. "That's the idea," Harold replied. Tracy turned sharply toward them. Her face shifted, confusion pulling at the corners of her mouth. "Wait, you work for Sunrise?" Harold didn't answer. Not out of pride, not out of spite. He simply returned his gaze to the lobby, his fingers resting once more on his wheels, like a man waiting for the next part of a conversation to find him. He didn't need to explain himself. The room was already beginning to explain it for him. Tracy's mouth opened slightly, as if she wanted to backtrack, to pivot, to reclaim some piece of footing she'd already lost. But nothing came out. Her arms stayed crossed, but her stance had changed. No longer rooted in confidence, now just something brittle, defensive, fraying. Behind the teller window, a young man in a blue dress shirt, Michael, barely out of college, paused mid-transaction. He looked at Harold, then at Tracy, then back down at the screen in front of him. He didn't know what to say, but something about the moment made him uncomfortable enough to stop pretending he wasn't hearing all of it. At the coffee station, the woman in scrubs leaned toward the man next to her and whispered, "She's talking to him like he's some nobody." Her companion nodded slowly. "But he's clearly not." Louise walked back to his desk, eyes down, typing something quickly. But Tracy still hadn't moved. She was watching the hallway now, her entire posture speaking of one wish: for someone to come out and make this go away. But no one did, not yet. Across the room, Harold sat composed. He hadn't raised his voice, he hadn't stood, couldn't stand, but he had shifted the entire room simply by refusing to be dismissed. He'd held his dignity like armor, and everyone present could see that. Tracy, for all her procedure, had failed to recognize who she was dealing with. Not because he was powerful, but because she'd assumed he wasn't. The cost of that assumption was just starting to surface. And Harold? He wasn't surprised, not at all. But there was a weight in his chest, a quiet heaviness that came from knowing this still happens, even now, even here. He took another slow breath, eyes steady on the hallway door. He was still waiting, but the waiting didn't feel like silence anymore. It felt like pressure, and it was building. The hallway door finally clicked open with a soft mechanical thud. Every head in the lobby turned, including Tracy's, her back straightened instinctively, lips pressing together into a polite, controlled expression. But beneath her posture there was tension. The kind that creeps into your spine when your authority starts to feel borrowed, not earned. Brian West, the branch manager, stepped into view. Early 50s, broad-shouldered with silver creeping through the sides of his neatly combed hair. He wore a deep blue dress shirt, tie loosened just slightly like he'd already handled a dozen fires this morning. His glasses hung from his collar on a black cord, and the calm way he walked gave the impression of a man who didn't waste time. He scanned the room once, just once, and took in more in 2 seconds than most people noticed in 10 minutes. His eyes landed first on Tracy. She looked back at him like she was ready to explain, maybe even deflect, but his expression didn't invite commentary. Then he turned and saw Harold. For a brief moment something shifted in Brian's face. Not shock, not panic, but recognition. He took 2 quick steps forward and extended his hand. "Mr. Jennings," he said, voice quiet, controlled, with a weight of respect underneath. Harold looked up and reached forward, shaking his hand without ceremony. "Brian." That single word made the front of the bank feel 10 degrees colder. Brian straightened and nodded once, respectfully. "I wasn't told you'd be visiting this location today." "I like to keep things simple," Harold replied. "Surprise visits help me see things for what they really are." Brian exhaled through his nose, not quite a sigh. "Understood." Tracy was standing perfectly still now, the clipboard still on the counter like a discarded thought. Her gaze darted from Harold to Brian and back again, trying to reassemble a picture that no longer made sense. "Wait," she said, a half-laugh breaking through. "He's not just from corporate?" Brian didn't even look at her. His jaw tightened. "Tracy," he said with an edge she hadn't heard from him before. "We'll speak later." "I just didn't know who he was," she blurted, her voice brittle now. Brian cut her off with a glance. Not cruel, not raised, but final. Then he turned to Harold. "Would you like to come into my office?" Harold motioned toward the counter. "I already submitted a document that should explain why I'm here." Louise stepped forward quietly, offering the folded paper without a word. Brian accepted it, opened it, and scanned it quickly. His face tensed, just slightly, as his eyes ran over the contents. Then he nodded. "Follow me, please," he said. Harold turned his chair toward the hallway, the wheels gliding silently across the tile. He passed Tracy without looking at her. But then, halfway down the hall, he paused and turned his head slightly. "You have cameras in this branch?" he asked. Brian didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir. 6-point coverage synced to our internal server." Haro gave a single nod. "Good. I'd like to review this morning's footage before we continue." Behind him, Tracy took a small, involuntary step forward. Her voice cracked. "Mr. Jennings, I didn't mean anything by it." "I didn't know." He looked at her, not with fury, not with disdain, just a directness that stripped away every excuse. "You meant exactly what you said. That's the problem." Then he turned and rolled himself down the hallway behind Brian, disappearing from the lobby. For a moment, no one moved. No one whispered. The air itself felt suspended. By the window, the woman in scrubs blinked hard and sat down. The man in the veteran's cap folded his paper neatly and placed it in his lap. The teenager opened his mouth, then closed it again, phone forgotten in his hand. Near the corner, a woman in a charcoal business suit had entered moments earlier and was now quietly watching from just inside the doors. Judith Emery, a long-time client of Sunrise and regional investor, didn't say a word until Harold was out of sight. Then she walked calmly toward the front counter, the heels of her shoes tapping softly on the floor. Tracy saw her and immediately perked up. "Good morning. Welcome to Sunrise Credit." "I'm not here for a transaction," Judith said flatly. That shut Tracy up. Judith turned to the hallway, then looked back at Tracy. "Mr. Jennings. I didn't know he was visiting this branch today." Tracy stared at her, not quite connecting the dots. "You know him?" Judith met her eyes without blinking. "Yes, he's a shareholder, a quiet one, but very involved when it counts." Tracy's face lost some of its color. Judith continued, her tone sharp but not raised. "I was told he'd be making a visit sometime this month. I'm just glad I happened to be here today." She turned, walked to one of the seats by the window, and took out a leather-bound planner. As she began writing in it, she didn't glance back. Tracy remained standing near the counter, arms folded tightly, but her posture was different now, shrinking, uncertain. She looked at Louise, then at Michael behind the teller station, but neither met her eye. The quiet wasn't normal. It wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that came right before a verdict. Michael, who had been watching from the teller window, reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and opened the camera app. He hovered over the record button, thumb trembling slightly. He didn't hit it. Not yet. The teenager beside his mother whispered again, "Is he like Some kind of undercover boss? His mom shook her head slowly, watching Tracy squirm. He doesn't need to be undercover, she said. He's got presence. Look how quiet she got all of a sudden. The lobby, once just another place people passed through on their way to money and errands, now felt like a waiting room for truth. The kind of truth that reveals itself not in drama, but in the space left behind when people realize they've said too much to the wrong man and too little to the right one. Tracy didn't speak again. She just stood there, staring at the hallway like a student outside the principal's office, praying for someone else to fix what had already shattered, but that someone wasn't coming, not this time. Brian's office was dimmer than the lobby, lit softly by the ambient glow of his monitor and the filtered light slipping through half-closed blinds. The room smelled faintly of old carpet and lemonwood polish. The hum of the building air vents, clicking keyboards beyond the wall felt distant here, like everything outside had been put on pause. Brian motioned toward the small conference screen on the wall and slid behind his desk without saying much. Harold rolled in, smooth and composed, positioning his chair beside the long table without needing adjustment. Brian tapped a few keys on his laptop, opened the security software, and queued up the morning's footage. I've pulled the recordings from the front lobby starting at 9:02, Brian said, voice low. Harold nodded. Start from the door. The footage began to play, time-stamped in the corner, crisp in its clarity. There was Harold, entering through the front doors, wheels gliding silently. Tracy didn't look up. No one did. The image was still. No movement stood out. Until it did. Her words weren't loud, but they were unmistakable, picked up clearly by the counter mic. Every eye roll, every dismissive gesture, every clipped sentence unfolded again in silence, this time to an audience that could not be ignored. Harold didn't lean in, didn't blink more than usual, he just watched. Brian, however, exhaled slowly and rubbed his temple. He looked at the paused screen. Tracy, standing behind the counter, eyes narrowed, clipboard untouched, posture tilted in indifference. He tapped a command and saved the video. I'll forward this to legal, he said. I'd already planned to ask, Harold replied, his tone neutral but firm. Brian nodded, then leaned back slightly, weighing something invisible in his mind. Mr. Jennings, I want to be honest. I've had concerns about Tracy's tone before. Staff mentioned she could be sharp, but her performance metrics have been solid and He paused, searching for the right words. I let it slide. Harold didn't respond immediately. He let Brian sit in it for a moment, his own admission. Then he spoke, measured, as always. I didn't come here to fire anyone, he said. That was never the goal. But I didn't come here to be spoken to like a nuisance either. I understand. Brian stood, picked up a folder from the corner of his desk, and looked toward the door. Would you prefer I handle this privately? Harold shook his head. No theatrics, just accountability. You do what needs to be done. Brian's steps were slow as he exited the room, and the sound of the latch clicking behind him was strangely final. He walked the hallway with a kind of gravity in his movement, each stride not rushed but deliberate. In the lobby, the atmosphere hadn't changed. It had deepened. The air was thick with unspoken realizations. Judith Emery sat with her legs crossed, still flipping pages in her planner without writing anything down. Michael the teller hadn't moved from behind his station, but his hands now rested flat on the desk, phone screen black. The teenager and his mom hadn't spoken again since Harold left the lobby. No one wanted to be the first to break the silence. When Brian returned, he looked directly at Tracy. Come with me, please, he said. Her shoulders stiffened. Why? What are you? We'll talk in the office. There was something about his voice that cut through her resistance, not sharp, not loud, just resolute. She didn't argue again. Her arms were crossed as she followed him down the hallway, but there was a hesitation in her steps that hadn't been there before. Inside the office, Tracy remained standing. She didn't sit, though the chair was there. Her arms stayed folded tightly across her chest, more like armor than confidence. Brian walked around the desk, set the folder down in front of him, and opened it slowly. He slid a page across the table toward her. Stills from the surveillance footage. "Tracy," he said, tone even. "This isn't a review, this is documentation." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. "You're not serious," she finally said, a nervous laugh slipping through. "I didn't know who he was." "That's not the issue," Brian interrupted. "Do you believe that what you said, how you behaved, would have been acceptable if he wasn't a shareholder?" Tracy swallowed hard. "I didn't mean it. I was just doing my job." Brian looked at her. "You were doing your job with judgment. You spoke to someone like they didn't belong in the building, like their time didn't matter. You didn't just break policy, you broke trust." Her jaw clenched. "It was just a mistake." He nodded once, slowly. One that everyone saw, one that says more about how you see people than how you see rules. She stood there, frozen. Brian reached across the table and set a company tablet in front of her. "I need your badge and your login code." Her hands trembled slightly as she unpinned her name tag and set it down. Then, after a pause, she typed out her deactivation sequence on the tablet, the soft clicks of the touch scene somehow louder than anything else in the room. When it was done, she looked up at Brian, her voice lower now. "He humiliated me." "No," Brian said calmly. "You did that to yourself." She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just picked up her coat, folded it carefully over one arm, and left the room without another word. As the door clicked shut behind her, Harold turned slightly in his chair at the front of the lobby. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was the kind of silence that marked a chapter closing. Judith looked over from her seat and gave a nod of acknowledgement, not celebration, not approval, just a look of confirmation. Michael returned his phone to his pocket. The woman in scrubs finally finished her coffee. The teenager stared at the doors, eyebrows raised, not in shock but in realization. No one cheered, no one applauded. But something had shifted. Not because someone in power had spoken, but because someone who wasn't expected to have power had simply stood his ground and made everyone see what they'd chosen to ignore. The sound of Tracy's footsteps faded as the doors closed behind her. She didn't look back, didn't speak, didn't meet a single eye on her way out. The empty space she left behind wasn't loud or dramatic, it was hollow, like a corner of the room had gone quiet in a new way. Harold sat near the reception counter, hands resting calmly on the arms of his wheelchair, gaze steady but no longer guarded. Judith returned to her seat by the window, folding her planner with a slow deliberateness, as if she had just witnessed something more important than any meeting she had planned today. The lobby had fallen into a silence that didn't feel awkward. It felt earned. Brian stood nearby, eyes moving slowly across the space, taking in the faces of his staff, the clients still sitting, the posture of the room. There was no small talk, no casual shuffling, only the subtle shift of people adjusting how they stood, how they listened. He turned back toward the hallway, then toward the employee break room. "Everyone," he said, not loudly but clearly enough to be heard, "please come out here for a moment." A few seconds later, 6 employees filed into the lobby, Lewis among them, still straightening his tie from where he'd been seated, Michael the teller, eyes wary but curious, the young woman from the loans desk looking uncertain but attentive, 2 other tellers who had stayed mostly quiet, and finally Clarence, the janitor, mop bucket parked just out of view. They stood in a loose semicircle near the waiting area, forming a quiet audience that wasn't sure what to expect. Harold didn't rise. He didn't have to. He sat just where he was, centered in the space, like the day had brought everyone else to him. He looked over the faces, not scanning, but connecting, one by one. When he finally spoke, his voice carried not with force but with presence. No one needed to be told to listen. "I didn't come here today to trap anyone," Harold began. "I didn't show up hoping someone would slip or to find a reason to fire a person. That's not what I do." No one moved, not even Brian. "I come to branches like this every few months. I don't announce it, I don't wear a suit. I come in quietly, like any regular man off the street. I ask simple questions, I observe." His eyes moved to Michael. "Not to test your math, not to see how well you know policy, but to see how people are treated when they look like they have nothing to offer you." Michael lowered his eyes. Harold continued, calm but unwavering. This morning I wasn't addressed as a client. I wasn't addressed as a man. I wasn't even addressed as a human being. I was treated like a burden, a problem. And the only thing that changed that was when someone realized I had power. The words hung there, weighty but never aggressive. They weren't meant to shame, they were meant to reveal. And they did. Luis's hands were clasped behind his back now, his posture proud but not rigid. Harold turned slightly toward him. "You," he said, "you didn't speak up to defend me. You spoke up because it was the right thing to do. That's what integrity looks like when no one's watching." Luis gave a quiet nod, his throat tight. Harold shifted toward Michael. "You recorded something because you knew it mattered. Not because you wanted to expose someone, but because your instinct told you, this isn't right. That's courage. You didn't need to act big, you just needed to act." Michael blinked hard, nodded once. He looked to the others. "Some of you didn't say anything, I understand that. I've worked in enough rooms where silence feels safer than the truth. But I need you to remember something. And this isn't just for banking, this is for life." He paused, leaning forward slightly, not to dominate the space but to emphasize the gravity of the next sentence. "The way you treat someone when you think they can't help you. That's the version of yourself the world remembers." A hush rippled through the group, not one of guilt but of realization. The words were simple, too simple to ignore. You don't have to be perfect, you don't have to be heroes, but you do have to try. Try to greet people with dignity. Try to make space even when you're tired. Every time someone walks through those doors, they're trusting you with more than money. They're trusting you not to make them feel small. Judith, still seated, dabbed at one eye gently with a tissue. Clarence stood quietly near the edge of the lobby, his mop now forgotten behind the pillar. Then, slowly, the older man stepped forward. "Sir," he said, his voice rough from age but warm, "I just want to say thank you for how you handled it." Harold turned to him. "What's your name?" "Clarence. Clarence Duval." Harold nodded. "Pleasure to meet you, Clarence." The doors opened again, sunlight spilling back across the floor as Harold rolled out into the afternoon. And though the bank would return to transactions, signatures, and policy manuals, no one inside would forget the man who had walked in quietly and left them all looking inward. Not because he demanded it, but because he never had to.